I was 17 the first time I realized how wrong a place can feel after dark. At that age, you don't really think about danger. You think about school, your crush, and whatever plans you're making for the weekend. And back then, most of my nights revolved around a girl I'll call Lynn. She lived just a couple blocks from me, close enough that even without a car, I could walk to her place in minutes. Right across from her house stood a small, forgotten neighborhood park. Not the cheerful, bright kind you take kids to, but the opposite, one of those old parks the city built in the late 70s and then pretty much gave up on. Rust-eaten slides, sun-bleached plastic tunnels, wood chips that smelled like mildew and stray cats. The swingset groaned like something was dying inside it. But it was private, and for a pair of dumb teenagers looking for somewhere to sit and talk at 1 in the morning, privacy was the only thing that mattered. It became our routine. Most nights, Lynn would ping me on AIM with a simple, "Park." And I'd grab a hoodie and head out. Sometimes she'd smoke, sometimes she'd ramble about her family, or drama at school, or just whatever popped into her mind after a long hit. I didn't smoke much myself, but being around her, it didn't matter. The park was our quiet bubble, cold, dark, and cut off from reality by a ring of tall, untrimmed pine trees that swallowed half the street noise. It was early October when everything changed, one of those nights when the air is thin and cold enough that your breath sticks in front of you like smoke. We were sitting on top of the old wooden fort that overlooked most of the playground. The whole place was lit by just one distant sodium street lamp, weak and orange, barely reaching the first few steps of the slide. And that's probably why I noticed him so late. At the very edge of the park, past the baseball diamond, there was an old wooden bench half buried in shadows. I'd walked through that place 100 times and never realized the bench was even there. It was so far off that under that dim street lamp, it was basically just a silhouette. But that night, somebody was sitting on it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The shape was so still it didn't look like a person, more like a cutout or a shadow painted onto the backdrop of trees. No movement. No shifting. Just this dark, upright shape facing our direction. "Hey," I whispered, interrupting whatever Lynn had been saying. "Do you see that?" She took a slow drag from her joint and glanced lazily toward the trees. "Oh. Him. Yeah, he's always there." I blinked. "Always?" "Every night we've been out here, pretty much." She shrugged. "Probably homeless. Or just weird. But he just sits and watches the swings. Don't freak out." That last part made me freak out. I kept staring at the figure. The amount of stillness coming from it didn't feel human. He wasn't slumped or relaxed, he was sitting straight as a pole, unmoving, like he was carved out of the night itself. Minutes passed. I tried to focus on what Lynn was saying, but every time I glanced back, he was there, an unblinking shadow fixed on the playground. And then, he moved. Barely. Just a slow lift of his arm, almost like someone checking a watch, but the movement was so unnatural, so painfully slow, it looked rehearsed. Like he did it just to prove he wasn't a mannequin. He lowered his arm again. And went right back to stillness. I didn't say anything after that. I just kept staring at him until Lynn finally announced she was freezing and wanted to head back. We climbed down the fort. The ground was soft and wet with wood chips. We started crossing the baseball diamond toward the street. The bench was still in my peripheral vision the entire time. But halfway across, Lynn suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Shoot, listen." I froze. At first, all I heard was distant traffic and our own breathing. Then it came. A long, slow, grinding squeak, metal rubbing against rusted metal. A sound I knew instantly, because we'd spent so many nights sitting by it. The swing set. But this wasn't the gentle movement of wind. This sound was rhythmic, slow, building, deliberate. Like someone was on the swing, pumping. I felt every hair on my arms rise. "That's not the wind," Lynn whispered. When we turned around to look, the swing set was just a dark shape in the shadows. We couldn't actually see the swings moving, but the sound, God, the sound, was unmistakable. And the figure on the bench? Still there. Still motionless. Still facing us. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her hand. We speed-walked across the field, the squeaking noise following us until, abruptly, it stopped. Cut off mid-groan, like whoever was swinging suddenly jumped off. And then came another sound. Much closer. A heavy step. Wood chips compressing under a heel. Not running. Not rushing. Just a slow, intentional step. Then another. Right behind us. That was when instinct kicked in. Pure fear. The kind that bypasses logic. We broke into a full sprint, running across the park entrance, across the street, and straight up to Lynn's driveway. We turned only when we reached the warm glow of her porch light. There was nothing behind us. Nothing at the park entrance. The playground looked empty. But the bench, still visible from where we stood, was now completely empty. The figure was gone. Before either of us could speak, a low, drawn-out creak rolled across the playground. Not the swing this time. Not the chains. It was the sound of the old spring-mounted rocking horse, the one that hadn't moved in years, settling after a push. That was the last noise we heard before we ran inside and locked the door. The next day, Lynn refused to open her curtains. She didn't want to look at the park at all. I tried convincing myself it was the wind, or an animal, or some guy messing around. I even asked one of my friends at school, trying to make the whole thing sound lighter than it felt. He told me we were being paranoid. That if the guy was dangerous, we'd already be dead. It didn't help. That night, lying in bed, all I could think about was that bench. That silhouette. The stillness. The sudden disappearance. And the footsteps behind us. By 11, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. So I pulled on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and walked back to the park alone. Walking back into that park alone felt like stepping into an old nightmare that hadn't finished with me yet. The street lamp cast the same washed-out orange glow across the grass, but everything else was buried in darkness. The air was dead still, no wind, no animals, just the hollow silence of after-midnight suburbia. I crossed the baseball diamond first. The weak beam of my flashlight jittered with each breath I tried to steady. I headed straight for the swings. They hung limp, unmoving. I reached out and grabbed one. The chain was ice cold. When I pushed it gently, the same deep, groaning squeak echoed out. Okay. That, at least, I could explain. Old metal. Rust. Age. I moved to the rocking horse next. It looked even worse up close, its paint peeling in long curls, its spring brown with corrosion. I gave it a single push with my hand. The noise was so loud I actually flinched. It matched perfectly with the sound from the night before. Two things explained. Two out of, way too many. Then I headed toward the tree line. Toward the bench. Every step I took made me feel more exposed, like the dark was watching me. The bench sat right where it always had, old and gray and half swallowed by shadows. I walked up to it slowly, scanning the wood, the slats, the ground. Nothing. No cigarettes. No trash. No footprints. Almost like no one had used it in years. But when I crouched down and shined the flashlight directly under the bench, my stomach tightened. There were two depressions in the dirt, shallow, perfectly parallel grooves. Not footprints. Not anything that looked human. I leaned closer. They looked like the marks left by the small rubber feet of a rocking chair. Something icy crawled down my back. The figure we saw, the one sitting frozen still for over an hour. It wasn't sitting on the bench. It was sitting behind the bench. On a rocking chair. A rocking chair. In the middle of a dead park. At 1 in the morning. The slow movement we saw, the arm lift, wasn't someone checking their watch. It was the faint arc of a rocking chair slowing down. I shot to my feet, suddenly aware of every rustling sound, every breath of cold night air. And that's when it happened again. A heavy step. From the direction of the playground. I whipped my flashlight toward the equipment, but the beam was too weak. I couldn't see anything. Only the hulking shapes of the fort, the slide, and the swings. Closer. My breath turned sharp and quick. I started backing away, keeping the bench behind me, my eyes locked on the darkness between the wood structures. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. Silence. Then, slowly. Not fast this time. Not like someone pumping the swings. These were slow, lazy shifts of weight, just enough to make the rusty chains cry out. My flashlight finally found the swings, and for a moment I thought maybe they really were just moving from leftover motion in the breeze. But then I saw it. A porcelain doll. Sitting upright on the tire swing. Perfectly placed. Perfectly still. White dress. Dark braids. Tiny black shoes dangling just barely above the wood chips. And the tire was moving just enough, maybe an inch side to side, to make the sound. I felt like the air was sucked out of my lungs. The doll wasn't there earlier. I had checked the swings minutes ago. Someone had placed it there. Worse, it was sitting exactly where Lynn and I usually sat. That was when the fear became something primal. Like I was being lured. Or warned. Or claimed. I dropped the flashlight without thinking. The beam spun wildly across the grass before dying against a patch of dirt. I didn't bother picking it up. I just ran. Not even looking back. Not slowing down. I sprinted across the diamond, past the slide, past the sagging backstop, all the way down the sidewalk until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Lynn. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to think about it. By the end of the month, we stopped going to the park altogether. Eventually we stopped going out at all. Fear does that, turns something normal into something poisonous. We broke up not long after. The park stayed there, though. And every time I walked past it during the day, when the sun lit everything up and the equipment looked harmless, I still felt watched. Like whoever or whatever had been sitting on that rocking chair was still somewhere in those trees. Years went by. I tried to forget about it. And mostly, I did. But one afternoon, I must have been in my early 20s, I happened to drive down that old street. The park caught my eye immediately, except it wasn't the same anymore. The city had torn out all the old equipment and replaced it with bright plastic slides, soft rubber flooring, cheerful animal sculptures. A total makeover. Except the bench. The bench was still there. Same shape. Same place. Newly stained, but unmistakably the same one I had stared at years ago while some unseen presence watched me from behind it. I pulled over. Against every reasonable instinct, I got out of my car and walked toward it. In the daylight, it looked harmless. Just a bench near some shrubs, nothing more. The ground was fresh mulch, no marks, no indentations. No evidence of anything ever being there. And for a few seconds, I almost let myself believe I'd imagined everything. Then a small bell rang from the new jungle gym. One of those little decorative bells they attach for kids to hit with soft foam mallets. Except nobody was there. Nobody touched it. And the sound wasn't a bright ding. It was a longer, deeper sound, like something heavy brushing against it. A sound that wasn't meant to get a kid's attention. A sound meant to remind me. I felt a familiar, suffocating weight settle over the area. A presence. Watching. Waiting. Patient, like always. I didn't stay long. I walked back to my car, got in, and locked the doors immediately. On the way home, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Over and over and over. And that's been my habit every night since. Because some fears don't fade, they just find somewhere else to sit. Somewhere dark. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere they can keep watching. I was 22 that summer, fresh out of college, back in my parents' house, and stuck working a retail job that felt like punishment for something I couldn't remember doing. My only real escape was running. Not casually, not for fitness, more like running from the claustrophobia of being home again. Those miles at dusk were the only time I felt like I was moving toward anything. My usual route was a looping 5-mile circuit that cut through a part of town I barely knew. The houses there were old, 1960s split levels with faded paint and drooping roofs, sandwiched between two massive industrial parks that went completely dark after 6 p.m. Right in the middle of that dead zone was a small, forgotten place called Ridgewood Park. That's where I stopped halfway through my runs. It had a water fountain that always tasted metallic, 2 crooked picnic tables, and a playground that didn't look like anything I remembered from my childhood. The playground had 4 slides. That doesn't sound weird until you see them. From left to right, they were lined up in a perfect row, bolted into a wooden platform that was probably older than me. The first 3 slides were normal, rusty metal chutes, each one sun-faded and too hot to touch even at night. One straight. One gently curved. One with a fast drop that made a hollow clang when the wind hit it right. And then there was the 4th slide. The one that never sat right with me. It wasn't even really a slide. It was a tube, a pitch-black, corrugated metal cylinder mounted at the exact same angle and height as the others. It had a small rounded opening at the platform and a matching circular exit at the bottom. When you looked inside it, the darkness swallowed everything whole, like it wasn't reflecting zero light but absorbing it. The metal looked wrong too, matte, almost industrial. It didn't belong in a playground. It belonged in a ventilation shaft in some abandoned building. The thing was completely enclosed, bolted tight to the frame. No way to see inside. No way to know what was inside. I used to stop and stretch near it, never getting too close. Every time, I felt this pull. Like gravity whispering to step closer, to put my hand on the opening, to peer into the black. I didn't like that feeling. It didn't feel natural. One evening I brought my friend Reed with me. Reed was the logic guy of our group, the calm thinker. The type who could look at a broken toaster and tell you exactly which wire was disconnected just by listening to it. If anyone could make sense of that tube, it was him. What the hell is that supposed to be? I asked, tapping the black metal with my shoe. Reed crouched beside it, running his hand along its surface. This isn't meant for kids. You'd go in blind, slam into the bottom, and probably break something. It's a design mistake. No one makes a mistake like this, I said. Look at it. It's built different from the others. Like it was added later. Reed gave his usual half laugh, half scoff. More like someone cut corners. Trust me, man, it's just a crappy piece of metal they welded on to finish the set. I didn't buy it, but I also didn't argue. Not yet. The next night, I brought another friend, Jenna, to the park. Jenna was the skeptic of our trio. The type who thought everything had an explanation, usually a boring one. I figured if I could show her what bothered me, at least I'd have company in my paranoia. Stand at the top, I told her. Just listen while I check from down here. She rolled her eyes, muttering, "You're such a freak," but climbed the steps anyway. Her footsteps rang out on the rusty platform. I crouched by the bottom of the black slide, lowering my ear to the opening. The metal felt colder than the night air, unnaturally so. The interior smelled like old dust and something sweet, like old candy wrappers left in the sun. "Jenna!" I called up. "Can you hear me? Stomp or something?" Nothing. I tried again, louder. "Jenna!" Still nothing. Then, something else. A sound so soft I felt it more than heard it. A quiet, high-pitched giggle. A child's giggle. Right inside the tube. It lasted less than a second before being yanked away, like a kid who'd put their mouth too close to a fan and then jumped back. Then came another sound. One I will never forget. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone closing a backpack. Or a sleeping bag. Right in front of my ear. I jerked back so fast I hit my head on the metal rim. "Jenna! What the hell was that?" No answer. I scrambled to my feet and looked at the top of the slide. My blood froze. The top opening, the circular entrance, was sealed shut by a solid metal plate bolted across it. Four huge silver bolts held it down. It hadn't been there 90 seconds ago. "Jenna!" I shouted again, panic breaking my voice. "I'm right here." I spun around so fast I nearly fell. She was standing behind me. On the ground. Phone in hand. "I never went up," she said. "You told me to, but then I got a message. You were down there with your ear pressed to the metal like a weirdo for like 2 minutes." I stared at the empty platform. At the sealed top of the black slide. At the bolts that shouldn't exist. "But I heard your footsteps," I whispered. Jenna's expression changed. Skepticism slipping into concern. "Are you okay?" I couldn't answer. My eyes were locked on the sealed plate. Except, it wasn't sealed anymore. The metal cover was gone. The bolts were gone. The opening was wide open again, the interior pitch black and bottomless. And in that darkness, I swear I saw the faintest flicker of red. Like fabric. Like a jacket sleeve. Vanishing deeper into the tube. That night changed something in me. The kind of change you don't notice at first, but it settles in like mold under wallpaper. I became obsessed, not with the park, not with the slide itself, but with the sound of that giggle and that zipper. They didn't feel like hallucinations. They were too real, too close, too intentional. For a week straight, I avoided that part of town during my runs. I couldn't even stomach jogging past the industrial parks without remembering the metallic cold of that black tube. Sleeping was almost impossible. Every time my eyes shut, I saw the sealed top, or imagined the zipper sound starting again at the foot of my bed. Finally, I snapped. I needed answers. I needed Reed. Saturday afternoon, broad daylight, people everywhere, I drove back to Ridgewood Park and called Reed to meet me there. Reed showed up 10 minutes later, annoyed but curious. The playground looked harmless in the afternoon sun, families on blankets, kids running around, dogs chasing frisbees. The kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But even in daylight, the fourth slide still looked wrong. It absorbed sunlight instead of reflecting it. It stood out the way a single burned-out bulb ruins a strand of Christmas lights. "What exactly are we looking at?" Reed asked, shielding his eyes. "That," I said, pointing. "And I need you to explain it. Because something's happening inside it." Reed walked straight to the structure like he was inspecting a faulty machine. He climbed up the platform, crouched by the top opening, and peered inside. "Yep," he said. "As I thought." "What?" "It's not smooth on the inside. It's ribbed. A kid sliding in there would shred their skin. It's not a slide. It's literally a pipe. A ventilation pipe or a repurposed drainage tube." "That doesn't explain the soundproofing," I shot back. "Or the fact that it sealed itself. Or..." Reed cut me off. "Alex, dude, it's a pipe. Someone probably welded it in by mistake. I felt that familiar panic spark under my ribs. I grabbed his arm. Listen to me. Something giggled inside it. Something zipped something shut. And I saw the opening seal itself with a metal plate. There was a pause. Reed stared at me like he wasn't sure whether I was joking or breaking down right in front of him. Finally he sighed. Okay. Fine. Let's explore it together. One last time. I nodded. Reed went to the bottom opening and crouched. I'll listen. You go shout from the top. I climbed the steps of the platform. The metal was hot under my hands. Kids laughed from the regular slides, but their voices sounded distant, muffled by some invisible pressure. I leaned into the black opening. The darkness swallowed everything, even my shadow. Reed! I shouted. Can you hear me? My voice echoed down the tube. I hear you. It's fine. Reed called back, his voice echoing slightly. I felt a wave of relief. It was empty. I'd imagined the rest. I could finally breathe again. I pulled my head back and exhaled. Then the atmosphere changed. Instantly. The sunlight dimmed, not gradually, but like a cloud passed over the entire sky in one violent sweep. The kids' laughter cut off like someone hit mute. The breeze died. The air thickened. I froze, still on the ladder, gripping the rails. The world had snapped into the same suffocating quiet I'd felt the first night. Like the park itself had taken a breath and was waiting. Then I heard it. Soft. From deep inside the tube. I told myself it was reed shifting, or a branch scraping the metal. But the sound wasn't external. It was inside. Slow. Crawling. Moving upward inside the pipe. Reed? I whispered. Tell me you hear that. Nothing. I looked down. Reed was no longer at the bottom opening. He was standing 20 feet away, talking on his phone, facing the other direction. He hadn't heard the scratching. He hadn't been listening. He wasn't even near the slide anymore. My body went cold. The scratching was now halfway up the tube, distinct, deliberate, claw-like. Then it stopped. Right below the opening where my head had just been. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The silence pressed in. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night. A soft, wet thump from inside the tube, right against the top. Like something heavy, something with mass, something living, had pressed its face, or its hands, against the metal from inside. Then a voice came through. Not a child. Not anything young. Not anything human. A slow, struggling whisper, its syllables distorted by the corrugated metal. Ka'ali. My name. Drawn out. Hungry. Like it had been practicing it. I lost it. I scrambled down the ladder so fast I missed the last 3 rungs, fell into the wood chips, and crawled backward like an idiot, gasping. Reed turned around at the sound of me hitting the ground. Dude, he said, rushing over. What happened? Why are you covered in dust? I was shaking so badly I could barely talk. You didn't hear it, I said. You didn't hear anything. I heard you shout, he said. Then you were just quiet. I thought you were messing with me. No. Something had taken his attention. Pulled him away right when the scratching started. I pushed myself to my feet and looked at the slide. At the black mouth of the tube. It was impossible to tell if anything inside was watching me back. But I felt it. I felt eyes. I felt a presence. I felt recognition. Let's leave, I whispered. Now. Reed looked genuinely concerned. He put a hand on my shoulder. Alex, man. You're scaring me. Let's get you home. I didn't argue. We left the park. I didn't run that trail again. I didn't even drive down that street anymore. But that wasn't the end. Because after that day, the scratching followed me. Not constantly, but in places it shouldn't exist. At night, when my apartment was completely silent, I'd hear faint dragging sounds in the air vents. When I walked through a parking garage, sometimes the pipes overhead would creak, even when there was no wind. And sometimes, when I stayed up too late scrolling through my phone, the ambient noise in the room would suddenly flatten, like the world was holding its breath. And I'd hear that soft, wet thump again. Always followed by a faint attempt at my name. Not perfect anymore. More distorted. More eager. Like it had crawled a very long way to get closer. I don't go near playgrounds anymore. Or ventilation shafts. Or anything rusted and cylindrical. And I live with a fear I can't explain to anyone, not Reed, not Jenna, not even myself. Because that thing inside the slide, it wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to reach me. And every time I hear that dragging scratch inside a pipe or vent, I worry it finally has. This story is about the fear of not being trusted, the kind of subtle psychological erosion that makes you doubt your own sanity until it's too late. It happened when I was 26, living in a new city and trying to build a new life with my fiancée, Chloe. We had bought a small fixer-upper in a quiet, older neighborhood. The backyard was huge and messy, and at the very back, nestled deep beneath an ancient, sprawling maple tree, was a forgotten relic, an old, circular sandbox, maybe 10 feet in diameter, made of thick, rotting plastic edging. It hadn't been used in decades. The sand was a patchy, dry gray dust choked with weeds. The house was our main focus, a chaotic swirl of renovation projects. Chloe was the skeptic in our relationship, practical, focused, and always looking for the logical explanation. I was the one who was easily spooked. We decided to tear out the sandbox first. We wanted a clear yard. We can't just bury it, Alex, Chloe said, pulling on thick work gloves. We need to dig up the sand and dispose of the plastic. This will be the weekend project. It wasn't an easy job. The plastic was brittle, and the sand was heavy. We spent the better part of a Saturday morning shoveling the dust-like, almost oily sand into wheelbarrows. The digging was slow and tedious. About 2 hours in, my shovel hit something solid. Hold up, I told Chloe. I found something. I knelt down and brushed the sand away. It wasn't a rock. It was a section of smooth, reddish-brown tile. I cleared more sand, and soon, a perfect square of glazed porcelain tile was visible, maybe 1.5 feet on each side. It was lying perfectly flat, beneath the center of the old sandbox. Looks like the last owners buried some old patio stones, Chloe said, looking over my shoulder. Classic DIY job. I kept digging around the square, and it wasn't a slab of patio. It was the top of a small, man-made platform. As I cleared the rest of the sand, a circular structure emerged. It was a low, tiled circle, maybe 5 feet across, and perfectly flush with the ground. The center tile I had found was a cap, and around it were rows of identical, perfectly aligned square tiles. This is too clean to be a buried patio, I said, wiping sweat from my brow. It's like a small foundation, or a weird little stage. Chloe was more interested in getting back to the job. Whatever it is, it's not coming out easily. Just cover it back up, Alex. It's flat enough for the new grass. But I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the perfect geometry of the circle. It felt completely out of place in our messy, overgrown yard. It had a strange kind of significance. I looked closer at the central tile. The center of the circle. It had a faint line around it, too fine to be grout. I took the edge of my shovel and gently worked it into the line. It gave a little. It wasn't a tile at all. It was a round, heavy ceramic lid, set into the tiled platform. I jammed the shovel into the seam and pried upwards. It took a lot of force, but the lid finally lifted with a sickening, wet slurp sound, like a seal breaking. A smell rushed out, faint but deeply unsettling. It wasn't the smell of sewer, or rot, or decay. It was the smell of damp earth, old metal, and something else, a clean, sterile, faintly metallic scent, like old lab equipment or a surgical theater. We both peered into the hole. It was a pit, perfectly circular, maybe 4 feet deep. The walls were lined with the same reddish-brown tile, perfectly clean. At the very bottom, there was only water. Clear water, maybe a foot deep, reflecting the light perfectly. But the water wasn't still. It was slowly, constantly rotating, creating a faint, smooth, counterclockwise spiral in the center of the tiled basin. Chloe, the skeptic, immediately took control. "It's an old well, or maybe an overflow drain for the property," she said, her voice strained but rational. "The house is old. They probably had a rainwater collection system." She went to the garage and came back with a heavy length of rope. She tied a wrench to the end and lowered it into the pit. It hit the water with a small splash. It didn't sink immediately. It floated for a moment, bobbing, before the weight finally dragged it under. "4 feet," she said, pulling the rope out. "The water is only a foot deep. No big deal. We'll just seal it with concrete." But as the water dripped off the wrench, I noticed something. The wrench was not wet with clear water. The water clinging to the metal was a faint, unsettling pink. "Wait," I said, pointing. "The water, it's pink." Chloe looked closely at the wrench. Her skepticism wavered for the first time. The color was unmistakable. A pale, blush pink. "It must be the color of the tiles leaching into the water," she rationalized, her voice a little too loud. "It's sitting water. Minerals." I knelt down and looked closer at the spinning water. I was sure. The pink color was swirling around the edges of the circle, where the water met the tile. And then I saw the detail that snapped the fragile barrier of logic. Floating on the surface of the slow, swirling pink water, right at the center of the vortex, was a small object. It was white, perfectly cylindrical, and pointed at one end. It looked exactly like a small, smooth tooth. I didn't reach for it. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the pit, at the spinning, pink water, and the small white object at the center, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over me. The clean, sterile smell was suddenly overpowering. The fear wasn't about the pit itself, but the implication. A perfect, sealed, tiled pit, with clean, spinning water the color of blood serum, and a single, child-sized tooth at its core. Chloe saw my face. She looked back at the pit. She didn't say anything about the tooth. She just quickly dropped the ceramic lid back into place. Thump. Slurp. The perfect circle was sealed again. "We're covering this with concrete. Today," she said, her voice quiet and absolute. The rest of the weekend was a blur of frantic, silent work. We hauled 5 bags of fast-setting concrete mix from the local hardware store. The sense of shared fear had replaced our usual calm, conversational dynamic with a tense, focused panic. We didn't talk about the pink water or the tooth. We just worked, driven by a primal need to permanently bury the imperfect circle. By Sunday evening, the pit was gone. A 6-inch thick, perfectly smooth circle of gray concrete now covered the tiled lid. The backyard looked cleaner, but the sense of unease was exponentially worse. We had buried a secret, not fixed a problem. For the next few weeks, the buried circle became the center of our lives, even though it was out of sight. I became the overreactor in our small drama. I developed a habit of checking the backyard before I went to bed, making sure the concrete patch was undisturbed. Chloe, ever the skeptic, tried to regain control by dismissing the whole thing. "It was just a defunct fountain, Alex. Or a creepy cistern. The pink was rust, the tooth was probably from a raccoon, she insisted one night. We covered it up. It's over. But deep down, she wasn't convinced. I caught her looking out the kitchen window at the spot in the yard several times a day. Her denial was now more for her benefit than mine. The strange thing started happening subtly, psychologically, like the house itself was protesting the burial. It started with sounds. At night, lying in bed, I would hear a slow, rhythmic scrunch sound coming from the yard. It sounded like something heavy and wet being dragged across the dry, packed earth, originating directly over the concrete patch. I would jump up, rush to the window, and see nothing. The noise would stop the moment the light was on. Then, there were the dreams. I would dream I was standing at the edge of the pit again, only this time, the water wasn't clear and pink. It was thick, black, and perfectly still. I would lean over and see my own reflection, only the reflected me was smiling, a wide, horrible smile that showed a mouth full of small, sharp, perfectly white teeth. Every time, I would wake up in a cold sweat, paralyzed by the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by a place. The worst psychological element was the feeling of not being trusted. The house started to feel like it was watching us, judging our efforts to hide its secret. One Tuesday, I was on my hands and knees in the living room, sanding the floor. Chloe was at work. I had the music blasting to cover the noise of the power sander. After about an hour, I stopped for a break. The silence that followed the drone of the sander was absolute. I heard a small sound, almost a chime, coming from the kitchen. It was a rhythmic tapping, like the gentle tapping of a plastic toy on a glass surface. I walked into the kitchen. Everything was as I had left it. The tapping noise was coming from the center island. I walked up to the island and looked down. Resting on the smooth granite counter, sitting directly on a copy of the renovation blueprints, was a small pile of objects. They were all small, perfectly white, and pointed. A pile of 13 teeth. Not human teeth. They were too small, too uniformly conical. They looked like the teeth of a small predatory animal, or maybe baby teeth, but they were all exactly the same size and shape. They were clean, dry, and bleached white. And they were arranged in a perfect, small circle. My breath hitched in my throat. I hadn't seen any animal remains in the backyard, ever. And how had they gotten inside the house? The doors were locked, the windows were closed. My mind raced through the rational options: a prank? A cat leaving its kill on the counter? But the perfect circle formation was what sent me spiraling. It was a message. A clear reference to the pit we had buried. I quickly gathered them up, my fingers shaking as they touched the cold, porcelain-smooth enamel. I wrapped them in a paper towel, feeling a powerful, desperate urge to destroy them. I ran to the backyard, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and panic. I lifted a corner of the new sod we had put down near the patio, dug a quick hole, and buried the bundle of paper towel and teeth deep in the earth. I packed the soil tight, smoothing the sod over it, praying that the ground would swallow the horrible message whole. Later that evening, when Chloe came home, I didn't tell her. I couldn't. I knew she would jump to a rational conclusion, a neighbor's cat, a taxidermy joke, and then she would start to look at me differently. She would see the overreactor in me and wonder if I was the one who had made the pile, driven insane by the psychological fear of the pit. The fear of not being trusted by my partner was more terrifying than the teeth themselves. I spent the evening watching her closely. We sat on the couch, watching a movie. She was relaxed, but focused. I felt a tension in the air, a kind of high-frequency hum that only I could hear. Suddenly, she shifted on the couch and her hand went to the back of her head, right where her hair was tied up. She winced slightly. "What is it?" I asked, my voice too sharp. "Nothing," she said, rubbing her scalp. "Just a weird itch. Felt like I had a twig caught in my hair." She reached up and pulled out whatever was bothering her. She held it in her hand for a moment, examining it, her expression thoughtful, not surprised. It was one of the teeth. It was still perfectly white, but the tip of the point was dusted with fine, black, dry sand, the exact sand from the old sandbox we had been digging in. I stared at it, frozen. She had her keys and her purse by the door. She hadn't been in the yard since the concrete was poured. The only way it could have gotten there was if it had been placed on her, or in her hair, while she was sitting there, or while she was out. The color drained from my face. This was no prank. This was no animal. This was a sustained, conscious intrusion. We were being watched, and our attempt to cover the pit had only provoked a response. The entity that had been contained beneath the sand was now moving. Chloe looked up at me, finally seeing the complete terror in my eyes. She slowly opened her palm, revealing the tooth. "Alex," she whispered, her voice cracking, her skepticism finally obliterated by the impossible reality of the object in her hand. "Is this one of them?" I just nodded, unable to speak. I had buried 13 of them. This was the 14th. The number of teeth was growing, and they were finding their way back to us. We packed a bag that night and left. We never went back to that house. We sold it, sight unseen, to a developer a month later, taking a massive financial hit just to escape the psychological hold of that backyard. To this day, I have not told Chloe about the other 13 teeth. The secret I kept is the true terror of the memory. The feeling that the imperfect circle wasn't a structure, but a boundary, and we had violently crossed it. I have the persistent, chilling fear that the house knows where we moved, and that one day, when I wake up, the slow, rhythmic scrunch of something being dragged across dry earth will be coming from my own hallway, and I'll find a perfect circle of 15 teeth waiting for me on the kitchen counter.